Yes, so far we have been talking a lot about development, about control over the center. But in this video, I actually would like to discuss with you the phenomenon of a flank attack, because especially in modern times, we see a lot of people using their flank pawns and ignore their central pawns. At least the control over the center has been not used optimally very often. Has its good and its bad things, but actually we all know that starting with a move like h4 would be a little bit silly because you're not really helping your development. But after having developed certain pieces and, for example, one of the sides has already castled in one way or another, it makes sense actually to use your pawns effectively. There are many examples, and also in the interactive section you get the possibility to show yourself what you're capable of when playing for a flank attack. But the following game is quite an impressive one, taken from the Olympiad, a game between Russia and France. It's white Jan Nepomniachtchi against Etienne Bacrot, and we're following the first moves. It's knight f3, d5, e3, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3. So actually this looks like just a queen's gambit declined, but it's not really the case, because white is purposely refraining from committing himself too early to the move d4. Especially in this setup, white has placed the pawn on e3, so going for a setup with d4 doesn't make sense, as you cannot get your bishop out anymore. And so the alternative way is that after bishop e7, you follow up with b3, so that you're intending to develop your bishop on the long diagonal. So you're keeping your pawn on d2. You're not putting the pawns on the central squares, but you try to control the center with your pieces rather than with pawns. It's an interesting setup. After castling kingside bishop b2, black goes c5. And now, okay, black has some sorts of ideas to play maybe a quick d4, maybe knight c6, and try to shut this bishop out of play, if that's possible. So this feels actually as if it's the moment to go to take on d5. Now black has a choice. You can actually also consider to recapture with the pawn, but then white also has ideas of going for d4 and play against an isolated pawn. With the bishop on b2, you have a nice control over the blockading square. You just keep on developing your pieces, bishop e2, castling. It's an interesting setup. It's a very fashionable line, and it's not a surprise that Nepomniachtchi picked it up for this game. Knight takes d5 is the other move, and it also makes quite some sense. Capturing with a knight, you're not fearing the knights getting exchanged, and particularly you would like to neutralize the pressure on this diagonal by putting the bishop on f6. So this is actually quite an interesting setup, and there are quite some games played before with this particular idea. Nepomniachtchi comes up with an interesting move, but I would like to mention that queen c2 has been seen here as well. And now after the move knight c6, it was actually Karyakin who introduced a new idea in the candidates tournament in Moscow in his game versus Vishy Anand, as he went for this move h4. And this is actually kind of interesting move, because rather than going for solid development in a central way, with castling kingside, you use the fact that you have postponed this idea of castling. You push your h-pawn, and you see there are possible mating threats with knight g5 coming up in the position. It is actually quite an unpleasant move to face. White has a lot of ideas. He would like to bring his pieces out. Let's say b6 was played. Black continues developing. And now white went for the move a3, stopping any sort of annoying plans with a knight jump to b4. So in some cases white could also consider putting the bishop on d3 if he wants to. And then you have two bishops who are looking at the black king. There are even ideas of playing knight g5, or maybe even push the pawn, push the g pawn as well. go for rook h3 and maybe go for rook lift. So there are multiple ideas which are interesting to cover. Why is this justified? That is actually an interesting question. I believe that such an approach with a flank attack, it's only really possible when you're not putting your pawns to your central pawns, you don't put them to offensive. So imagine you have pawns on, let's say, e4 and d4, not exactly in this position, but in general, then it would be much easier for black to target those pawns and open the center. And when the center is open, you know that it's much easier to generate counterplay for the defensive side. So I like this kind of combination by keeping your pawns very flexible on d2 and e3. You put a bishop on the diagonal, and the light squared bishop is also free to move. And of course the move a3 is like a prophylactical move guarding the b4 square. So this is interesting. Just give you a couple of moves, because in the game Anand went for the move f5. And in later games, white players went for knight takes d5, and after e takes d5, apparently this position is just quite nice for white. The engine prefers it. You could play a move like d4, or maybe even bishop b5. It seems to me that the weakening move f5 creates a nice hole for white on the e5 square. So definitely there is some play for white in such positions. Let's go back to the present game of Nepomniachtchi against Bacrot, as white went for this idea with h4 immediately. Also interesting, and not revealing immediately where the queen is going to. For example, now after the move b6, Nepomniachtchi decided not to put the queen on c2, but instead put it on b1. Of course it has similar ideas, as you're looking at this pawn on h7, but one idea is also that you don't want to waste the tempo on a move like a3, as you don't want to be disturbed with ideas like knight b4. So interesting idea. Black went for the move h6, because apparently ideas with knight g5, they're kind of unbearable. So the move h6 was played, but the move like h6 also creates other problems, as white went for the move g4. So here, very aggressive setup, but your king is absolutely safe in the middle of the board, especially black's pieces aren't developed yet. It's very difficult to reach the white's king's position in the center. Of course, there are also drawbacks to this setup, as the rook on a1 is not able to participate, but you cannot have everything. This is a bit of a problem, but now you have provoked black from playing this move h6. You can actually start thinking of an attack with your g-pawn. Black goes bishop b7, but of course you got to be a little bit careful, because there are some threats on this diagonal. So g5 will be met by knight takes c3, and that drops a piece. But that also explains Nepomniachtchi's next move, rook h3. Very interesting hypermodern opening play, as the rook is leaving the diagonal, it's protecting the knight. And once again, it's very difficult for black undertake some action in the center. Black went for knight to d7, and after g5, suddenly, okay, black is already under some sort of pressure, as white is about to open the king side, and you don't want to leave that unpunished. So the move h5 played, trying to keep the files closed, and now bishop is coming to d3. I really like this setup, and here you see one of the ideas that with the queen on c2, then knight b4 would have been annoying, and that's how you save a tempo. So bishop on d3 has the idea that after knight b4, you go bishop h7, king h8, and now bishop e4. So this is also kind of typical maneuver seen in many openings, that you try to bring the king to a more vulnerable square on h8, especially for endgames. You're like one square further away from the center. But also here, more concretely speaking, it's also standing in the diagonal of the b2 bishop. So I like this idea. And well, imagine if you would take on e4, you got to be a little bit careful how to recapture, because if you take with the queen, you suddenly also have problem that the queen in the middle of the board is more vulnerable, and there's also a hole in your position. So black would actually consider to play c4. Very nice dynamical resource, with the idea of playing knight c5 and put a knight on d3. And if you take with the queen, well, there are all sorts of ideas to play rook c8 and then, or maybe even start with knight c5, and there are all sorts of kind of tricky ideas. But after bishop takes e4, I think knight takes e4 is actually quite a nice move. So we were talking about this flank attack. So you see that actually white is not really able to get any further, as it looks like, as the h-file remains closed. But such advanced pawns, they also have a huge influence on the mobility of the opponent's pieces. And for instance, here you see that the knight on d7 and the bishop on e7, they can hardly move. They cannot go to f6. And that makes it actually quite nice for white building up an attack. And it should be said that after knight takes e4, one of your key ideas is actually to play knight to g3. Very important idea to win the pawn on h5. And you cannot protect it with the move g6 because of the bishop on b2. So I like this conceptual play by white. So that's why black didn't fancy training of light squared bishops. Knight goes to d5, and now knight e2 was played. And I like this concept once again. Now bishops are still on the board, but the weakness on h5 remains there. So knight g3 is pretty much a serious threat, as you're about to win a pawn. If you go bishop d6, I will just continue my plan with knight g3. You gotta give up your dark squared bishop, your nice bishop, and after rook takes g3, okay, you're not getting immediately mated, but I think things are quite scary for black. One typical idea could be to play g6, after which the remaining pawns on the king side have been separated from protecting the pawn on h5. Pawn on h5 becomes isolated, and after that you can consider ways of challenging that pawn. For instance, the queen might return to d1 to attack the pawn on h5. So there's a lot of play, and thanks to this setup, leaving your pawns in the center on its initial squares, only with the pawn on e3, it's very difficult for black to develop active play. So realizing the dangers of his position, Bacrot went for this move f5, but this is very dangerous and it's not really solving the problems, because after g takes f6, black wanted to recapture with a knight. Of course, this is a huge strategical concession, because now, okay, on one hand the knight is getting into play, but you're also weakening a new square. So after knight takes f6, you can actually play knight to g5. Very unpleasant move. Your pawn on e6 is vulnerable, but also your light square. So even though there might not be an immediate threat, it's just getting more and more unpleasant. Having said that, there is a big threat, because if I don't do anything with a move like queen d7, I can actually take on d5. The problem is you cannot take with the knight, because then it's checkmate on h7. And after bishop takes d5, if you capture in another way, I will actually take on f6, eliminating a remaining defender, and it's going to be mate anyway. So I like when the plan comes together. A lot of pieces in the attack. Every piece had a special task. Having provoked new weaknesses, it's very difficult for black to deal with this threat of bishop takes d5. So that's why knight takes e4 was played. But now you capture with the queen. You're threatening checkmate. Knight f6 is not possible because bishop is hanging. If you take on g5, then there is h takes g5, creating a new threat of rook takes h5. So, for instance, if you take on g5 now, they would just follow knight g3. And on the next move, you're about to take on h5, after which the position will be opened. And this is just kind of hopeless. So instead, black went actually for the move knight f4 trying to create some counterplay. But it simply doesn't work because there's queen takes b7, and if you take on h3, then you're getting mated via the 7th rank. And if you go knight to d3, check, you can just play king f1. Rook takes f2, king g1 doesn't make a difference because there's still this mating threat. And if you take on b2, I can take on h5, but I can also take on f2. It's just game over. So instead of rook takes f2, knight takes b2 was played. But now there is rook takes h5 check, king g8, and now the final touch is g6. Fantastic move, especially with this flank attack. It's nice to finish off the game with this pawn move. You're locking up the king, very thematical in such positions, and well, the problem is that the queen is about to come over back to the h-file. So if you play queen f6 threatening mate, you can actually play rook h8, king takes, queen h1 back. Nice way of using the queen, and after queen h7 would be checkmate. So that's why after the move g6, black resigned. I liked very much White's concept of keeping the pawns on its initial squares, combining it with a flank attack. Doesn't mean that it's always working out well, but it was very difficult for black to challenge the center, and particularly it's very nice to see that we have played only 24 moves, but the white queen has been on b1, then on e4, then on b7, and then it could come back to h1 and then even give checkmate on h7. So it has seen the entire board, and that's quite nice to see that with this kind of flank openings, it's not only about playing on the flanks, but it's about using the entire board. So you will get to see more of this in the interactive section.